Rockets fans, welcome to the Rockets Launch Pod, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets. Whoa! Sports Talk 790. Rockets! Ready to go! Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Rockets Launch Pod starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome back to another new episode of the Rockets Launch Pod presented by Clutch Fans. I'm Ben DuBose. He's Paulo Alves. We're your host. You can follow me on social media at Ben DuBose, Paulo at Paulo Alves NBA, and the show at LaunchPod790 on X, where if you hit up the link tree, you can support friends, partners, sponsors of the program, all that good stuff. Anyway, jumping into today's show, it is Tuesday, the 31st of March, the final day of the month. Rockets back in action tonight against the New York Knicks, nationally televised game on NBC, a rematch of that game from Madison Square Garden right after the All-Star break, perhaps the most brutal loss of the season. I say perhaps because the Rockets might have outdone themselves last week with the 13-point collapse in overtime against the Minnesota Timberwolves, the biggest blown overtime lead in modern NBA history. So it's a shame that we have to make that comparison, but regardless, it is an opportunity for the Rockets to get some redemption against a good team. Rockets are 45-29, tied for fifth in the West. So in terms of the race for potentially having home court advantage in the first round, top four seeds get that. It's a game they probably need to win. Rockets are 25-10 at home this season, but just 20-19 on the road. I think more than any standings implications, where even with the recent losses, they're still right in the mix. Spots between number 3 and number 6 in the Western Conference standings are all tightly compact at this point. I think the Rockets just need to see themselves go out and have a good game against a quality opponent, and that's what tonight represents an opportunity to get. And then you have a couple of games after that you should be able to win. It's a 3-game homestand. Tonight against the Knicks is the most difficult one. Then you've got the Bucks on Wednesday, night 2 of a back-to-back, and the Utah Jazz, the tanking Utah Jazz, on Friday. So as far as today's show, we're now within 2 weeks of the playoffs, final 8 games of the season. So we're going to be looking ahead. What do the Rockets need to get better at as they get ready for a first-round series that will start the weekend of April 18th? But we'll start by looking at the positives. They do enter today on a 2-game winning streak, and the biggest reason for their recent success is something of a resurgence from Alperen Sengun. He scored 30 or more points in 3 of his last 4 games, but most notably, over 7 games since coming back from a back injury, a stretch beginning March 18th against the Lakers, Sengun is averaging 24.9 points, 9.3 rebounds, 7.1 assists, 1.6 blocks per game, shooting above 62% overall and almost 67% true shooting. So the true shooting has improved for a while. I had heard, if you listen to my Clutch Fans Live post-game shows with Dave Hardesty, I had talked to someone in the organization who said about a week ago that they were noticing some positive signs in terms of his motor, the defensive intensity, the attention to detail. The results in terms of wins and losses for the team have been mixed. Basically, the Rockets have had a 2-game winning streak, followed by a 2-game losing streak, and then the same pattern repeated itself. That's been the case for the last 8 games. So it remains to be seen what it means for the collective and whether they can make some noise in the playoffs. But even if we just look at it individually, Paulo, you've talked about Sengun a lot this season, his apparent regression from last year. Even if it doesn't necessarily translate to team success, there is something important to seeing that Alperen Sengun heading into the 2026 offseason can be something of a cornerstone player for your future. He is still just 23 years old and a 2-time All-Star. So, Paulo, let's start there in terms of what the Rockets can potentially do in the playoffs and also what it means for your outlook on Sengun entering the offseason. If this continues, if you get something close to this version of Sengun the rest of the way, how much does it change your assessment of Sengun relative to when we last potted a couple of weeks ago and you were still pretty down on him.
Yeah, as far as the outcome of this team, or kind of the chances looking into the playoffs of this team, Alperen Sengun being a cornerstone piece, at least on offense, is a bit of a game changer. I don't think it turns them into, a championship contender. We've talked ad nauseum about what we thought the limitations were for this team and where they sit at the moment. They still don't strike me as a team that can just catch lightning in a bottle. But Sengun being a lot better on offense does solve half of the equation of, typically with the types of center that Alperen Sengun is, you typically want, he has to be such a great force on offense that it outweighs, his defensive limitations. And of course, I do think that within, the type of center, the type of offensive help that Sengun is, he is, better defensively than you would expect, which gives him some slack on offense. But if he's able to be, a bona fide offensive star, which is what he has been since he came back from those 2 games that he didn't play, and that was part of the argument when he was playing poorly, when he was having, issues with his touch, that he was playing through injury, and he's been tough in playing through injury at multiple periods in his career. If that 2-game break truly was him getting over the hump from an injury perspective, and we had heard, over the week prior that the effort had been ramping up with Sengun. If that's something that's trending upwards and it's not a blip in the radar and it's something that he can build upon, I do think that helps the Rockets massively, because now all of a sudden you're not depending on KD and his decision making and his turnovers. As great as he is offensively at pure scoring, you now have someone who can reliably take pressure off of him. And, like it or not, KD is an all-time great, but he does need someone like that. And we've seen time and time again throughout the season that when that's not happening, the team struggles mightily. And we, I think, can pretty safely assume at this point that this team's not going to flip or it's not going to turn the corner defensively. So perhaps their easiest path to a good playoff run is just getting hard offensively and just trying to run teams over on that end. So Sengun being better or being this much better is definitely something that may change the outlook going into the playoffs. I still don't think it makes them a threat to a team like the Thunder, or in my case, the Spurs, who I do think are a tier above as well, just because of the impact that Wemby has. But it does trend upwards, not only for the season, but for next season as well. And I think the biggest thing, perhaps, obviously the shooting numbers are really important, and we've kind of taken those for granted going into the beginning of last season with Sengun. And then he had this, elongated slump, which that had some weeks where it looked to be getting better, but then eventually regressed again. To me, the biggest deal, especially for this stretch, is the turnover issues, right? And when you look at it, yes, he's had 1 5 turnover game, which is rough against Minnesota, but him limiting turnovers is that important on a team that can't kind of win the possession battle as heavily as they used to back when they were the best offensive rebounding team and back when they were just a terrific defensive team. Right? If that's not the case anymore, then you got to take better care of the ball. And I think he's been doing that the last few games. And so that's to address how this impacts going into the playoffs, going into next season. I'm not sure how much it impacts it, because I've said in previous spots that I do believe that if Fred's fully ready to go and everybody is able to be on the same page, and then we get Steven Adams back, then, I think the best path is probably to run it back with those 2 extra pieces, because whatever changes are going to make, they're probably not going to be as high impact as just getting 2 bona fide starters who are taking up 35-37 million of your cap space, back onto the team. Like, those are 2 huge upgrades that the Rockets can get in the offseason. So Sengun playing better, I guess, makes it less likely that you pursue a move such as a possible Giannis trade. But that was really far down the pecking order of outcomes, at least as far as my eyes looking at it. Beyond that, I do think that Sengun playing better and looking better going into the offseason maybe makes you look at, if the chemistry is totally not there. And I think there was some overreaction to it, but that clip with Tari Eason struck me as just a tiny bit of shade towards KD. I know Sengun's not native English speaker, right? But it didn't seem like they were fully, that it doesn't seem to me like they're fully a cohesive unit. Obviously, you can grab whatever highlights you want out of the games, and there are moments where it looks like they are. But it might have impact going to the offseason if you want to retool around the core without KD and you want to spend assets with KD, or try to kind of reorganize the team like that if you believe that what kind of zapped the mojo out of this team was in part at least KD, or if you don't think that those relationships are mendable, or if you think that they're just, kind of trying to weather the storm until the offseason comes. I do think that Sengun playing better makes it more likely that they may pursue a different type of team building approach. But as I said before, just running it back with Fred being back, potentially with a better Dorian Finney-Smith, although I would advocate for a change there. It just seems like it hasn't worked out. And Steven Adams being back is the most likely scenario. I think, this week we've seen a lot of reports about Houston wanting to trade for Giannis and pressing hard to trade for Giannis. Obviously we're not in the room, but we hear things, and I don't think that there's as huge of a push within the Rockets to do a Giannis trade as it's been reported. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. I'm just saying it doesn't seem like. Yeah, it doesn't feel like it's option one, and it felt like a weird timing for so many people to be talking about it at the same time. But going back to Sengun, obviously Plan A would be bringing everybody back, but even beyond that, on a more long-term, few years on the road perspective, Plan A will always be to have Sengun be a core piece of the puzzle, because even if you have reservations about archetypes and have reservations about, potential effort issues with his defense, whatever it may be, they got Sengun on a 5-year deal that's significantly below market value. And so Sengun panning out is exponentially more kind of rewarding than it would be for a guy that's, just making max money or that's being overpaid. Like, that's a bargain contract, which does keeping Sengun some leeway from cap building perspectives. But, Plan A is always for Sengun to pan out, and that's overwhelmingly the best case scenario for the Rockets. So Sengun being back to, the offensive player that we know he can be will never, not be perhaps, besides an Amen Thompson, breakthrough to being a 1A or a 1B guy, type of guy, is the best thing that can happen for the Rockets, if that makes sense. So it does have that impact long-term beyond just this offseason.
So let me phrase it a slightly different way. If Sengun maintains something close to this level of play and extends it into the playoffs, what does that mean in your eyes for this offseason? Because I have wondered if any of these young guys is going to be a playoff riser. And perhaps this is the year it can sort of be the inverse of last year. I've thought a lot the last few weeks when it's become increasingly clear that this regular season just is what it is. And at this point, 45-29, they have to go 7-1 just to match last season's win total. They're certainly not going to be number 2 in the West. They have to go 8-0 to exceed it. So they're probably going to fall short on basically every level. And this trend of letting close games slip away, not having crunch time execution, at least for the regular season, it's defined this team. It is what it is, and it's defined some of these players as well. However, we saw last year when it was the exact opposite, and they basically overachieved all of their expectations for the regular season, and yet they go out sad in the first round. They lose to the hated Warriors. They lose a home Game 7, and it did cast a little bit of a shadow over the offseason, and I think it played a role in them parting ways with Jalen Green in the eventual Kevin Durant trade. So there is a world where the opposite happens this year, where maybe they're the 5 or the 6 seed, but just like, a year ago, it was Minnesota in the 6th seed. And next thing you know, they're in the Western Conference Finals. All of a sudden, if the Rockets win a playoff series or two, then perhaps we're looking at this season and some of the players in a different light. And I think there's a case to be made. The playoffs could offer a lot of these, especially younger players, a chance to start fresh. Ime Udoka, after the Minnesota game, he referred to that being the worst loss yet in terms of their just late game collapses. I think, at least to some extent, it's weighed on these guys. And I think when you get to the playoffs and you get to the final few games of the regular season, at this point, there's no real ability to change the narrative as far as the regular season. It just is what it is. I think to an extent, until very recently, they've been hoping to turn it around, that making 1 or 2 tweaks is going to potentially get them the extra bucket that they need or the extra stop. And all of a sudden they can get back to what we all envisioned this team being at the start of December when they were 13-4 with one of the 5 or 6 best net ratings in NBA history. Now, they didn't have Fred VanVleet then. They did have Steven Adams, so they aren't quite the same team, X's and O's. But nonetheless, I think it's crystal clear now, at least for the regular season, that's not happening. The issues are real. And so all you can do is hope you get to the playoffs, turn over a new leaf, and perhaps that chance to start fresh without being burdened by everything that's happened over the last 4 or 5 months could be refreshing for a lot of these guys, especially the younger guys who haven't been through the grind before. And really, so many of the young core here in Houston, the last 2 seasons, Ime's first year when they went 41-41, coming off of 22-60, and then last year jumping from 41 to 52, it's been nothing but positive vibes. This year has been different. This year, at times, it's felt like the year from hell, and I think it's weighed on young guys that haven't been through it before. Perhaps they get a second wind. And so if Sengun is one of those guys, and I guess the same could apply to any of the other young core as well, but if he builds on this momentum down the stretch of the regular season and continues it into the playoffs, maybe wins you a series against a team like the Lakers, the Nuggets, the Timberwolves, whoever it is that you draw between 3 and 6, does that potentially change your view, Paulo, in a way that just extending it over the regular season might not?
It's never going to turn it into a successful season, as we talked about what a successful season was in previous spots. But if he sustains this level until the end of the season and into the playoffs, I mean, I think it has to make you a lot more optimistic about next year than it would otherwise. It will buy the front. I think it will buy the front office a lot of leeway with the fan base and a lot of optimism going into next season, which is needed, because then there's a lot of people that are really mad, and typically the fans being really angry at the team is not a good thing. And as far as being a playoff riser or not, I do believe even though Alperen Sengun's stats from last season don't look great in the playoffs, that was a specific type of series that I don't think you can extrapolate his numbers to normal efficiency numbers. I personally thought that he was a playoff riser and that he played in the big moments. He wasn't afraid. It's just that you're facing Draymond Green, who's a great defender, and they were walling up, and it was hard for and Jalen Green was stinking it up so bad that a lot of the times Sengun was being forced to do things by himself. Jae'Sean Tate was obviously a playoff riser. Just look at his stats. But going into if Sengun ends the regular season like this, I would be confident going into the playoffs that he, was going to perform well. And if he does compile a good playoff run on top of going the rest of the regular season like this, which is not a long time, it's 8 games left, whatever it may be, it will help you in the sense that it will buy you leeway with the fan base to just running it back with Fred and Steven Adams, which is pretty good. It might buy you chemistry within the team, and openness to running it back and being fully invested next season, and hoping that with Fred, with Steven Adams, that you're just that away from potentially being a much better team, which is pretty fair argument to make. Those guys are really good, high impact players. As far as what you said about for some of the young guys to be the first time they go through this sort of slump after last season was such a world beaters type of season from a morale standpoint. I mean, it might have some impact. Not sure it's needle moving, although vibes are really important, and young players can very easily spiral, and careers are altered based on the team atmosphere that they are dropped into. Besides Jabari and Sengun going into the playoffs, Reed's really interesting for both the good and the bad. Like, is he going to be a playoff riser as far as making shots goes? Is he going to be completely exploited on defense in the playoffs because of his size? And then, obviously the playoffs erase a lot of regular season struggles, especially for Tari Eason going into a contract year. There's not a lot to be saved because he's been substantially worse than the player we all thought he was going to be. But if he goes into the playoffs and has the playoff series, which he can have, especially if you draw the Lakers, like they have LeBron and Luka, you're going to put a man on one of them, and he's likely the second best guy to put on the next one. Maybe Josh Okogie, but he seems to be fallen out of favor as well. So, yes, there's still a lot that can be saved from this season. Yes, it starts with Sengun because he's the biggest, needle mover, I guess, as far as when he plays poorly versus when he plays well. But, especially from a how we're going to start next season standpoint, Sengun playing well makes you feel that much better about the future of the franchise, because Sengun, for a lot of his faults, is the one guy where they severely overperformed his draft slot, right? They whiffed on Jalen Green. I think that's really fair to say. Jabari Smith-Jr. was from not a great draft, but for the number 3 overall pick, to get someone who's probably going to be an elite role player is good, but not great. But not necessarily getting that much star power. And until Lamar Thompson, even though his impact is great, until he ascends into a shot-creating star, he's a really good player and he's good value, but he's not necessarily, the number one guys. And that's what a lot of people would create a lot of anxiety with fans. It's, okay, after all of this, do we have someone who we can call our Cade Cunningham or Anthony Edwards or Shai Gilgeous-Alexander? That's the biggest issue. And Sengun being who we thought Sengun could be coming out of last season is, as I said, the biggest swing you can possibly have to close out the season. So yes, it does completely change the outlook of next season if Sengun is able to do that. And I'm rooting, as I think we all are, for him to do that, because that would save us a lot of trouble and a lot of tough decisions going into the offseason. Because you can reasonably say, chalk up last season to the style of play, and chalk up the part of this season when he wasn't great, which was extended period of time, to injury. Because the timeline does line up. He had those, he was trending towards being better, had those 2 games of a break, and now seems to be playing better. The fact that he made 5 threes out of 7 shots in the last game is intriguing, and I'm wondering even how you feel about how that factors into his health. Like, is he just more comfortable shooting jump shots when he's fully healthy? Because we saw early on in the season he was shooting it a lot, and then for a very long period of time he'd shoot 1 or 0 a game, and now all of a sudden he shot 7 and made 5 of them, including the first 5. Not sure how that factors in. Sometimes that's what's frustrating with Sengun, because it's tough to understand what dictates his shot diet.
Yeah, I'm not going too far down that road until we see it more consistently. Like, I've been burned before. So as far as the hypothetical, I'm much more willing to have that conversation if he starts off next season hot from 3, if we see it more in training camp, in the preseason. I think it's pretty far-fetched to think it's just suddenly going to click less than a month before the playoffs. I would love to be wrong, but that's the kind of thing I'll take it as a positive development when it happens. And I think Sunday in New Orleans against a bad Pelicans team was just something of a heater. A lot of them came from the same spot on the court, right at the top of the key. I think he got in rhythm. The Pelicans didn't take him out of rhythm. I would be surprised. I don't think it's a great discussion topic for this week's pod. I would love to revisit that in a week if he proves us wrong, but that's just, my sense. I'm much more focused on the advancements he's made in other aspects of his game, most notably defensive intensity and finishing near the rim, which it feels like both of those things have picked up this month. As far as other areas of the team beyond Sengun, since we last recorded, there have been a few changes. Looking at the bench, Aaron Holiday's playing in place of Josh Okogie. Jae'Sean Tate is playing in place of Dorian Finney-Smith. But then the big change, Tari Eason now coming off the bench, Reed Sheppard starting. That was a change that it felt like all of Rockets Twitter had wanted for a few weeks. But then most notably, Tari Eason, at least over the past week, his last 3 games, is actually playing well again. So you're getting a better version of Tari Eason. Now, it should be noted, over that same stretch, Reed Sheppard has not played that well. And we've seen quick hooks because defensively, when Reed and Sengun are together, that's problematic. So even though Reed is starting, he gets a relatively quick hook. And lately in the closing lineups, it's been Tari in place of Reed. So in terms of whether the current starting 5 is going to be the starting 5 in the playoffs, that's still very much an open-ended question. Ime Udoka said when they made the change before the Miami game, or before the Atlanta game, that it would be a trial run for probably 8 games or so, and then the final 5 games before the playoffs, they'd make a determination and try and get in some sort of rhythm with the starting lineup and rotations. And that 5-game mark is going to come this weekend, 1 week before the playoffs start on the 18th. Well, no, 1 week before the end of the regular season. Then there's a week gap between the regular season and the playoffs. So I think it's interesting. It's not that Reed deserves to be demoted. However, when you look at the firepower between the entrenched 4 of Kevin Durant, Alperen Sengun, Amen Thompson, and Jabari Smith Jr. By the way, Rockets are a ridiculous 22.5 points better in net offensive rating this month when Amen plays. His growth has sort of flown under the radar, but he's been really good in recent weeks, so we should give him his flowers as well. Perhaps he's a playoff riser, just like Sengun theoretically could be. But looking beyond the big names, further down the rotation, I'm curious your thoughts, Paulo, when the playoffs open for the Rockets on the 18th or 19th. And I'm going to confidently say that because there's 4 games of separation plus the tiebreaker between the Rockets and the Suns, and there's only 8 games left to play, 7 after tonight. So no, I do not see, it's not mathematically impossible, but the Suns would have to win out and the Rockets go 3-5 or worse. That's extremely unlikely. Not impossible, but that's just like Sengun and the 3-point shot, that's one of those we'll cross that bridge when we come to it situations. I don't think it's something you should plan on. So I think the Rockets are going to finish somewhere between 3 and 6, probably 4 and 6, because they're 3 back in the loss column without the tiebreaker against the Lakers. So when they open the playoffs on the 18th or 19th, I'm curious, Paulo, your thoughts. Does Ime Udoka stick with Reed Sheppard? Does he go back to Tari Eason? And also, does he stick with Aaron Holiday and Jae'Sean Tate in place of Josh Okogie and Dorian Finney-Smith? What are your thoughts on those choices?
The logic I'm going to employ is a bit flawed, but obviously it's a small sample. And I'll preface it by saying, yes, I know Tari Eason had been struggling for a while before I say what I'm about to say. But the truth is, since the swap, both are playing worse than they were playing before. I think that's fair. So it doesn't make, and from a logic standpoint, from a lineup standpoint, since before the change, I had always said that it didn't make that much sense for Reed to start because Reed and Sengun defensively is rough. And because the second unit just has terrible firepower if Reed Sheppard's not in it and to balance it out and to play the minutes with Clint Capella and everything like that. And so, to me, if I had to bet on it, I'd say that he reverses it. If it's Tari Eason starting or not, I'm not sure because it would be kind of promoting Tari while he's playing awful, and that's not a good precedent to set. Would they consider perhaps, starting Okogie again or starting Aaron Holiday or starting someone else? Perhaps we're too deep into the season and there's not enough games for them to test that out before moving into the playoffs. But granted that they're going to make a change or judge it as a package of games where Reed started, these few games in a row, I would say you can't look at it and argue for it to continue, at least from my perspective. So to me, that question is very obviously Reed should not start, and it's not, it's because he's played, worse when he has started. It's just it doesn't really make sense on paper. So I do think that change is going to be made. As far as Aaron Holiday and Jae'Sean Tate, so I know Jae'Sean Tate was just a plus 27 in 12 minutes in their blowout win against the Pelicans, but I don't think Tate is as good of a player as he was when we were terrible. I think there's been a regression on defense. Decision making has always been rough. Offensively, he doesn't seem to be as crafty as he once was. I just don't think he's a viable solution, even though he just, popped off from an impact perspective. I don't think he's going to play. Aaron Holiday is a different... Aaron Holiday, I think, has a much better chance of playing if those two guys that you mentioned, Okogie and Dorian Finney-Smith, still struggle. And especially if Reed Sheppard struggles as well. I could see Ime, giving him minutes in the playoff series in place of him. Especially because I do think that Aaron Holiday is a significantly better defender than Reed Sheppard is. And a significantly better spacer than the other two are. Going into the playoffs, I would not expect Tate to get, regular rotation minutes. I would not be surprised if Aaron Holiday did. But I do expect him to go back to Okogie and Dorian Finney-Smith at least a little bit before, just discarding that in the next few regular season games before moving on from that. If you don't play Dorian Finney-Smith in the playoffs, what does that do to him? Not to him, but to his value and to the management of him as an asset. Not that that's the utmost priority. I mean, depending on what your expectations for the playoffs, it might be if you think it's lost anyway. But going to the off season, and he's a guy that you just didn't play in the most important games of the season when you clearly had space for him to play in the rotation. How does that work? And the other choice, I guess, is to just shorten the rotation even more and to play the current guys even more minutes. I don't think Ime would be scared to go into an 8-man rotation and, just cut some of those guys off completely.
I hope he doesn't do that, because I really do think some of the ridiculously awful turnovers that we see late in games are because some guys are a little bit short on juice. So I hope with this particular team and its tendency for turnovers and big spots that they're mindful of minutes, even in the playoffs. Try not to go 40 plus for any of the regulars, because if they're already a little bit turnover prone, then being gassed can take you from being somewhat turnover prone to just ridiculous plays like we saw, especially late in overtime in Minnesota. I'm curious, you mentioned being bearish on Tate. I'm a little higher on him, especially if you pair him with Aaron Holiday, who can shoot threes and space the floor. I think sometimes Tate can be a tough fit if there's not enough shooting around him. I think if you have Holiday to help the team from a three-point volume perspective, that can make Tate a little more playable. But if it's not Tate and it's not 8-man rotation, and we should mention, obviously, Clint Capella, at least to a small degree, is going to soak up some minutes as the backup center. Do you think it's DFS or Josh Okogie who would get those Tate minutes as the other backup forward beyond Tari Eason? That's if Tari's coming off the bench, but you know what I mean.
It's rough. I think Ime would. I think Ime would try Dorian Finney-Smith first, and if it doesn't work, I think it'd be quick to pull the plug and get Josh Okogie in there.
Fair enough. For the record, I think I'll start with Dorian. I think his value is baked in. I think at this point, they're going to have to take him into next season, and hopefully he bounces back with a few more months to let the ankle heal. And if he doesn't, then you can use him during the season as as neutral salary filler. I think even in the offseason, on the books for $13 million next season, he'd be something of a negative asset. Maybe there's a mega trade that you have no choice but to use him for. But realistically, I think you carry him into the season. There's some upside if he returns to form. And if he doesn't, then at next year's trade deadline, regardless of how he plays, when that contract is expiring and more than half of it is already paid off, at that point, he'll be worst case neutral that you can use to upgrade the team somewhere else. So I just don't think anything that happens down the stretch is going to change much when it comes to his value this offseason, unless he just goes off in the playoffs and all of a sudden, reverts back to who he was a year ago with the Lakers, which, it's not impossible, but we are definitely running out of time. And then what I'll say with Josh Okogie, I know the numbers say overall that he's been a positive difference maker this year, and I'm certainly not blaming any of the recent downturn on Josh, but I would just urge people to keep in mind that so many of the metrics that Josh has accumulated came from that 13-4 start when he was starting. And no, they were not 13-4 simply because of Josh Okogie. There were a million things that were different about this team in the first 6 weeks of the season. So that's just meant to provide some useful context. I don't think it's as simple as saying, well, here are the advanced numbers that Josh Okogie has put up, and this is what you can expect if you put him into the current version of the Houston Rockets. Like, it's not that he's done anything catastrophically wrong. Like, he's certainly an option, but I just think he's getting a little bit squeezed because as of late, the Rockets, they need to be closer to parity on three-point volume. The defense just isn't good enough to grind out wins otherwise. And so I think in terms of the guard options, Aaron Holiday provides something, especially if you're starting Reed. And so you're not going super small, playing two backup guards in Reed and Aaron. Then relative to Josh, the ability to put up more threes, that's appealing. And then the forward spots, Tate and DFS just play with a lot more physicality. I know Josh has the 7-foot wingspan, but you do have more physicality with Tate and DFS, a better ability to bang down low. And I think that's something that appeals to Ime Udoka. So I'm actually thinking, as of right now, that Holiday and Tate both would play if the playoffs started today. However, the margins are close enough that if Tate doesn't sustain his level of play, we'll see what happens tonight against the Knicks. That was a matchup where I thought he started off playing well, but then he sprained his MCL that game right after the All-Star break when Karl-Anthony Towns rolled up on him. We'll see how he plays under the bright lights, and we'll see how, Ime has mentioned giving more opportunities to Josh and DFS. And so I would say right now, I do think it would be Tate, but the margin is close enough there that I think it's subject to change. And then, Reed versus Tari, I do think the one pushback I'll give you, Paolo, I do think that over the last 3 games, Tari has been better relative to before the change. Like, these last 3 games have been really positive for him. However, I don't think that it's a situation where he has to stay in that 6-man role to get that version. I think he just needed something of a spark. He needed to see something go right. They had a team meeting in Memphis. It sounded like they bonded. You mentioned the interview that he had with Alperen Sengun when Alfie had his arm around him. There's lots of little things that may have contributed, but I don't think it's as simple as he can only function as a 6th man. No, he was really good in that starting lineup when he took the reins on Christmas the first couple of weeks, and then it gradually fell off. And as his 3-point numbers declined, other aspects of his game did as well. I just don't think it's a requirement that to get this version of Tari, he has to come off the bench. And if it's not a requirement, then yeah, I do think it makes more sense to start him just because from an X's and O's perspective, it just makes more sense with how many high usage guys you have in that starting 5 to have someone that can do the little things, that can defend, that is more versatile. I just think if that's your closing lineup, if you're having to make these quick subs at the 8-9 minute mark of the first and third quarters, at some point, assuming Tari doesn't fall off again, or unless Reed starts going off for 20 and 10 again, I think it's just going to be a situation where if this is clearly the lineup that Ime is most comfortable with, why doesn't he just start it? And the bottom line is the switch. I know it will cause some heartache for a lot of our fans, but the change was never about, coronating Reed Sheppard and saying he's a star in the making, he's a starter for the foreseeable future. It was about trying to get Tari Eason right, trying to get him more comfortable. And now that he is more comfortable, I do think, assuming it continues, my bet would be that he eventually finds his way before the playoffs back in that starting lineup. Anyway, last segment before we close out, we've talked a lot about the playoffs because, truth be told, it's more fun to look ahead to what's going to happen starting the 18th of April than it is these final 8 games, because regardless of exactly what seed the Rockets are, regardless of what record they have over the final 8 games, I don't think it's going to dramatically change how we feel about this season. The only way that can dramatically change how we feel about what we've seen this year is if they go on a run in the playoffs, as we've talked about for a lot of this episode. So I want to look ahead to that series that's starting in mid-April. Obviously, we'll talk much more about it when we know who the opponent is, and we're still a couple of weeks away from that. But at this early stage, Paolo, who do you think is the most favorable draw between the Nuggets, the Timberwolves, and the Lakers? Because as mentioned earlier, I think mathematically you can't none of these teams can catch the Spurs, who are pretty entrenched as a top 2 seed, and I don't think it's realistic for any of them to fall to the play-in range and be caught by Phoenix. So I think it's pretty clear that either in the 3-6 or the 4-5, we'll see what seed, we'll see if the Rockets have home court advantage, but it's going to be one of those 3 opponents in all likelihood who you draw in the first round. And I think I'm leaning Lakers. Jaden McDaniels has some knee soreness that, depending on what happens there, you could tilt me in the direction of Minnesota. But the reason I would prefer the Lakers over Minnesota, I did not like what we saw from KD against Jaden McDaniels last week. I think the Rockets need KD to be able to, tap into the all-star, all-NBA version of himself to have a chance. And I think Jaden might be the most difficult one-on-one matchup for him among all of those 3 teams. And what I keep going back to with the Lakers, even with everything going wrong for the Rockets and not having Sengun one of those games at all, both of those losses to the Lakers and Houston were still there for the taking entering the final 3 or 4 minutes. And it took Luka going absolutely crazy for the Lakers to scrape by. So even with the Rockets doing so many things wrong, not having Sengun one game, Tari being broken, it was still right there for the taking. You could sort of argue the same with Minnesota, although the Timberwolves didn't have Anthony Edwards for this game. So I would caution reading too much into that. And then earlier in March, Denver was the game. I know it was night 2 of a back-to-back on the road, but they just drilled the Rockets. And I also think they're the most talented team overall between Jokic, Jamal Murray, Cam Johnson, Aaron Gordon. There's just so much high-end talent on that roster. For me, I think it's Lakers at 1, Minnesota at 2, and Denver at 3. I would prefer home court advantage. So if it's close, like if I could have home court advantage against Minnesota and I would not have home court advantage against the Lakers, that might tilt me a little bit towards Minnesota, pending what happens with Jaden McDaniels and his health. I'm assuming he'll play, but the question is how effective he will be. But just generally speaking, I would say that's my order. I think regardless, with this limited version of the Rockets, what we've seen since the All-Star break, there's no silver bullet. There's nothing that's going to dramatically change their outlook. I just think they're outmanned from a talent perspective against Denver. I would prefer the Lakers or the Timberwolves, and probably the Lakers, because even with everything going wrong, the Rockets were still right there, those 2 games that were played a couple of weeks ago. And then on Christmas, when things were going right for the Rockets, obviously they drilled the Lakers in LA. So that's sort of my outlook. Paolo, what's your perspective as far as the optimal draw and how important is home court advantage, given that, they're 25-10 at home, but 20-19 on the road?
I think home court advantage is critical. The stats speak for themselves. It's not necessarily that I think Houston has a massive home court advantage like Denver has, for example, because of the altitude, or some other teams have because of the crowd. Although in the playoffs, the Toyota Centers typically take a step up. But the stats tell you they seem to be a lot better at home than they are on the road. That has to have a reason. As far as the opponent goes, I don't feel too strongly either direction. I think all of these teams, including the Nuggets, are about the same caliber. The Nuggets are just hotter right now. But I do think that really good defense is what stifles the Rockets the most. And I think lower resistance on the defensive end is what this team can more easily exploit to get to a second round. So I have the Timberwolves as opponent I least like, because with Gobert, with Anthony Edwards, with Jaden McDaniels, as you said, I think they are the tougher matchup because I think they can bog the game down more for the Rockets offense, and then I have very little faith on our defense to stop them, especially if Anthony Edwards goes magnet ball as he usually does against us. Not that Luka does it any less against the Rockets or against, within the last few weeks, any team. But the Wolves are the team that I'm the most scared of. Beyond that, between Denver and the Lakers, you've got to say the Lakers are the easier matchup. I don't believe that defense. I don't believe it's sustainable. And their offense comes a lot from, their 3 main guys. And I think the Rockets have, if our wings lock in defensively, I do think we have the defensive stoppers to throw at them and the defensive hooks to throw at them to at least slow them down a little bit better. They can slow us down. I do think these games are going to be shootouts. So I would prefer the Lakers over the Nuggets, but I would prefer the Nuggets over the Wolves because I think just the Wolves have a recipe for disaster. And I swear it's not recency bias from them having beat us without. And so yeah, I'm pretty confident in that, but I don't think I don't think that they are in different tiers. I think they are within the same tier as far as opponents. Not as teams, obviously they are within the same tier as teams because of their record. I mean, from the Rockets' perspective, I don't favor any of them too much over the others, but if I had to order them, that's how I'd go.
I do think with Minnesota, there's something about Alperen Sengun against Rudy Gobert that seems to bring out the best in Alpi, but I don't know. If Sengun's as hot as he's been lately, perhaps that's an advantage for you no matter what. It's just, for all the pessimism over that last Minnesota game, the look in Sengun's eye when he went to work against Rudy, that's the one thing. I do think having an incentivized Sengun, and perhaps the playoffs will do that no matter what, that's a huge variable for the Rockets. So for all the difficulties of that matchup, and your points on Ant are valid, I mentioned Jaden McDaniels on KD, but I do think Sengun against Rudy and bringing out the best in Sengun, that might be a little thing to tip the scales the other way. I think to your point on home versus road, I looked up, I think the biggest reason for the split, two of your young guys, and it makes sense, young guys often shoot better at home than on the road. Reed Sheppard at home, 42% on threes, on the road, 36%. Jabari Smith Jr., 38% at home, 34% on the road. So Jabari and Reed both are shooting much better in Toyota Center than away from Houston. So I think that that's just a little thing, but it makes sense. Young players, especially young role players, tend to play better at home. And if you get the best version of Jabari and Reed, that can go a long way towards giving you a chance to win a playoff series against a good team. Final topic I want to get to before we close out, and we'll be quick here. I won't do a full-blown segment, but there is some positive news, undisputably positive news on the Houston basketball scene, and that's the return of the Houston Comets. It's been rumored for some time, but now that the WNBA has a new CBA for this season and beyond, the league can get down to business, and the Connecticut Sun are relocating to Houston after this season. Rockets hired Kevin Pelton to a front office role. I think the first official hire for the Comets, and of course, Kevin, longtime analytics guru for ESPN, but he's going to be something of a liaison working with the Connecticut front office this season as they go through the draft, free agency, expansion draft, any trade opportunities during the season, and then we'll see what the Rockets choose to do. Well, the Comets, we should say, although the Rockets and Comets are both owned by the Fertitta family, when the team gets to Houston this offseason and starts preparing for 2027, which will be their first year to play as the Houston Comets. This year they will play as the Connecticut Sun. And so certainly it's fun to have more basketball. We're a basketball-friendly podcast, but I think the bigger takeaway as far as the Rockets, and this is not a Comets podcast, it's a Rockets podcast, it shows you that Tillman Fertitta, Patrick Fertitta, they're serious about spending. They are spending $300 million to bring the Sun from Connecticut to Houston. That is a record price for a WNBA franchise. They just spent $75 million on a new practice facility, which is pristine and the envy of the league. They spent at least $10 or $20 million, I don't have the exact figure in front of me, to renovate Toyota Center and to bring in the new seats, which are almost complete. And I think you'll see that in the playoffs with the new black seats instead of the red and other upgrades they've made to the arena in the 2020s. So when you combine those investments, I mean, between landing a WNBA franchise, upgrading Toyota Center, new practice facility on Houston's west side, that's well over $400, maybe even $500 million in investments this decade for certainly the Rockets, but just the broader basketball scene in Houston. So the Fertittas are clearly willing to spend, and as I see it, relative to the first few years that Tillman owned the Rockets, and there were these concerns about, is he going to pay the luxury tax? That's another thing. He's paying the luxury tax this year on a team that pretty clearly doesn't have championship potential. He's pretty clearly paying the luxury tax so that the Rockets can maintain guys like Dorian Finney-Smith and Clint Capella as trade assets, as matching salary into the offseason and into next year. So there's lots of little things, but they all point in one direction, that this ownership group gets it. They're willing to spend. And in terms of the big picture, keeping this team together, opportunities to improve the team moving forward, this does not feel like a cheap ownership group. If it ever did, it certainly doesn't feel like that to me now. And even if, the big story is obviously it's just great to have a WNBA franchise again, Comet Sportime champions, and hopefully they can, resume that legacy. I think from a Rockets perspective, it has to be at least something of a positive indicator that this ownership group is in fact willing to do what it takes to win at a high level, right?
Yeah. First off, it's awesome that Houston is getting a WNBA team again. It was always a travesty that the team that won the first 3 championships just stopped existing, just from an historical perspective.
First 4.
First 4? I thought it was just 3. Well, first 4
was 4. 97, 98, 99, 2000.
Yeah, even more so than what I thought. Well, team that clearly has, the history, the legends to market itself. I do, being picky about it, there is really have to be, the Sun. I think the Sun are the 5th worst team in the league, and they don't own their own first round pick. Not gonna pretend to be draft guru for the WNBA, but as far as Tankathon tells me, there's 15 picks in the first round. I'm not sure what the conversion rate on those is. The Sun has the 12th and the 15th, being the 5th worst team in the league. We'll see how it goes. It's probably going to be a while before they're good. But as far as what you said about the implications for the Rockets, I think it's very, very hard to shake for a lot of fans the fact that they dotted the tax during the Harden years, which felt like, prime contending years where they were just a little bit, well, obviously a hamstring away, but just a little bit of the slimmest of margins away from winning a championship. That's going to be hard to shake. But if you're honest and if you're impartial over the last few years, the Rockets were always near, at worst, average, and always near the top of, salary expenditure during the tanking years, which is not normal. That's usually when owners save money because they're not bringing in money because the team's tanking. They've bought second-round picks. They've taken salary dumps or second-round picks, which are the small things that you can do as an ownership group to help the team while the team's bad. They've paid big bucks for head coaches. Now they are paying the luxury tax for a team that very clearly isn't worth it. And when I can pretty much guarantee if this was back during the Murray years, we cut the legs from teams that were better than this then, and we're not doing it now. So clearly, there's been a learning curve there, and there's obviously the factor of having guys for an ownership group, having the guys running the team that you trust, and then they are your administration, and obviously it matters as well. But I don't think you can reasonably say Tillman and the ownership group has been cheap for the last few years, since Rafael Stone took over. I don't think we have anything to complain about. Quite the opposite. Yeah, I think it bodes well, but it's not like I was worried about the Rockets' ownership being cheap the last few years. So it's not like I was one of those guys where, I need them to prove to me that they're not cheap by doing X, Y, and Z. No, when you look at the details, I had always thought that they weren't being cheap ever since Rafael Stone took over. I won't talk about before that because, obviously Brandon Knights and well, we all know what happened. So yeah, I don't think that's and I've seen it sometimes in reference to potentially, firing Ime Udoka and why they won't do that. I don't think it has to do with the money. I don't think the 6-year deal that he got in the offseason has to do with it as much as they believe he is the right guy to be leading the team. And I think that once they don't, or if they ever don't, I think they'll fire him. I don't think they'll keep him because of his contract. Because that's not what they've shown to be over the last 5 years now. So yeah, I think that's mostly sour grapes from previous times that hasn't been the case for half a decade now.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And obviously we'll talk about Ime more leading into the playoffs, his strengths and weaknesses. When we learn the opponent, we'll talk about how the matchup might go, what Ime is going to do, what he might be resistant to. And then, of course, when the season eventually ends, we'll review what we learned this season, the good and the bad. To this point, there's certainly been more bad than we would like. And it's not that I don't want to talk about Ime now, but we've already spent an hour going through some of the recent changes to the team. And I think future shows will be much more Ime focused when we talk about matchups in the playoffs, adjustments, and then ultimately reviewing the season, what they accomplished and ultimately did not accomplish. So not ignoring the Ime thing. You'll hear more from us on that in April. Anyway, that'll do it for today. Well, no, let me put a bow on the Fertitta discussion, because I think beyond the points that you laid out, I think one small thing to keep in mind, whatever you think of the politics, I think Tillman Fertitta getting that job in Italy, where he's now the U.S. ambassador, I think for the Rockets, that's a good thing, because it gives even more power to Patrick, his son, who lives and breathes basketball. So if your fear was meddling from a guy who has a million other things going on besides basketball and might not understand all the implications, Tillman's now got a full-blown job, and he's half a world away from the Rockets most of the time. So he has no choice but to trust Patrick, a guy who lives and breathes basketball. He's the alternate governor, and with Tillman literally not here, alternate governor means you are the governor, you are the owner. So the fact that this is truly Patrick Fertitta's franchise, and that basically, for the most part, Tillman's going to go on what Patrick tells him, then that's ultimately for the betterment of the team, because I promise you, Patrick really, really cares. He's got a competitive streak. He is looking at things through strictly a basketball lens. That doesn't mean we're always going to agree. It doesn't mean that he's going to make every decision along the same lines as what Rockets Twitter or Rockets Blue Sky would prefer. But I think in terms of, is it about basketball or is it about business, the fact that it's now even more Patrick Fertitta in charge from an ownership perspective, that should make you confident that it's about the basketball, and the recent investments reflect that. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly touch on the Fertitta angle, because I saw at least one post last week when the vibes were at their lowest, I think, amid those Chicago and Minnesota losses, comparing the Houston ownership situation to teams like the Bulls and the Kings that don't spend much. And my reaction was, what the hell are we doing? Like, it's fair to critique the roster and its development or lack thereof. It's fair to critique Ime Udoka. It's fair to critique Rafael Stone. No one is beyond being second guessed. But I think if there's one thing you can point to, at least in this iteration, this decade, since the page was turned to Rafael Stone and Patrick Fertitta in this version of the Rockets, they have spent at a high level, and that's something that you should have confidence in moving forward. I think certainly the lead storyline is that it's just great to have the comments back, but I do think it speaks well to the fact that, yeah, the Fertittas, they're serious about spending money, and even if the comments are the lead story, what it means for the Rockets, it's a secondary angle that I think is positive for fans of this team. Anyway, with that, I will finally bring this episode to a close. We hadn't had a show in a couple of weeks, so went a little bit longer than I would like, but longtime listeners know that's what me and Paulo do. And if you want more content from us until that next show, the best place to get it is on social media. Paulo is at Paulo Alves NBA. I'm on there at Ben DuBose. Mentioned that the show is on X at LaunchPod790. Hit up the link tree in the bio. You can support friends, sponsors of the program. And one of those, of course, Clutch Fans. This is the Rockets Launch Pod presented by Clutch Fans. I do the post-game YouTube shows with Dave Hardesty. So just go to the Clutch Fans YouTube page. That's in the LaunchPod 790 link tree as well. And you can hear me on a more frequent basis. Anyway, for today, this is where we break. For Paulo Alves, I'm Ben DuBose. As always, we appreciate each of you so much for listening. And please come back soon for more new episodes of the Rockets Launch Pod. Go Rockets.